Alright. Seems like doing a new recording software because I want to get like face cam going, but it seems like it's working. So just reacting to this video, commenting on it. Want to be transformative and shit. I've already given my or I've already watched like the first minute of it at one point, but it's all it is. So for the most part, I'll be going into this news. So that's it.
For decades, the world map seemed like a simple divide between democracy and
It's
authoritarianism, the
been
West and the East. This was the post-war consensus of alliances built on ideology over realpolitik, but that was always a fragile balance held in place by status quo. Under that model, the
yeah.
democratic European
I do sorry, I'm just very careful about my recordings, but yeah, I do agree with that to a certain extent, right? Because you had it after the Cold War with the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, and the two were, engaging in power politics with each other. And not to say the U.S. has never done anything authoritarian, but they had elections. The USSR didn't, not really, at least. I think like among the Politburo they did, and that's about it. And yeah, you have this whole like idea of like China and Russia, the authoritarian world versus the West, the democratic world. It's the idea that like Joe Biden, believed in very strongly and everything. And it's really only with Trump that the global sort of order is being thrown into disarray. So that's true.
Union and authoritarian People's Republic of China aren't supposed to be partners, but could they be? The
Possibly.
answer is more complex than trade, values, or foreign policy, and honestly kind of surprising. So, if a new Sino European partnership were to emerge, what does that mean for the United States, for Russia, for the rest of the world? What is actually going on between Europe and China right now? At the time of making this video, the EU and China are locked in an economic standoff, and while some have likened this to the trade wars between the US and China, what is unfolding here is far more interesting. See, the EU and China are each other's second largest trade partners. For the EU, China stands only behind the United States, and for
Surprising.
China, the European Union stands only behind the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. China is
Which is interesting because like China's trade is like increasingly moving towards like other parts of Asia, right? I did see recently, one like YouTuber who I've seen a little bit of like mixed community post a lot. They talked about how like Japan is like economically dependent on China, it's like that. So China seems to be consolidating like their own area and making it maybe sort of like almost like an economic bloc, kind of separate from the West, and everything like that, which is good for their self-sufficiency for China's and for kind of I'm not quite sure what it means for the other Asian nations because on the one hand you could say like they're less dependent on the West, but they're also more dependent on China. So but they're small countries, they're kind of going to get the small countries get the shit out of the stick all the time is the unfortunate reality of geopolitics. So we'll see, we'll see.
Europe's number one source of imports, and Europe is China's paramount source for high-end lithography machines essential to fueling its tech boom and maintaining its competitive edge against the US. Trade ties between the two have only deepened over the years, but clearly that's coming to an end, right? Not exactly. See, Europe's relationship with China and trade dependency has always been framed in the scope of close European partnership with the United States. For more pro-American politicians, this meant limiting China and favoring the US. For those more skeptical of the Americans, it meant balancing the US against China economically. Now, things are changing quite rapidly. The Europeans are pursuing what they call strategic autonomy, with more urgency than ever. They see a hostile Russia on their border, willing and able to launch several year-long military campaigns. And they see a United States both under the Biden and Trump administration
Able to launch several year-long military campaigns, yeah. Able to win them, that's a different story, right? If they were to actually try and attack the EU, I guess they probably would overrun the Baltics, or at least part of them. Maybe like get up to the Daugava and Latvia or something. But beyond, they wouldn't even come close to marching on Warsaw. I'm sorry, the Russian military is just too shit to actually do much. Even like with Belarus on their side. Even Belarus didn't help out with the invasion of Ukraine. They're not going to help out in the war against NATO. So Russia could probably use Belarus as a base. The Baltics would be again just due to their geographic position kind of fucked, but the rest of Europe would, as long as they play their cards right, they would be able to hold fine. It's Yeah, of course, complacency isn't okay. You don't want to take chances, but yeah, Russia shouldn't overestimate their strength either.
as unwilling to continue its past level of investment to NATO and the European sphere. At best, mind you, while at worst it perceives the US as a potential geopolitical and economic threat. As such, the Europeans are seeking independent redundancies, domestic energy reinforcement, and alternative partners. But China is not excluded from Europe's strategic autonomy vision either. And speaking of military power and modern warfare, I want to thank today's sponsor, War Thunder. If you're a fan of military history, armored warfare, aviation, or modern combat, War Thunder is one of the most comprehensive military vehicle games ever made. You can play for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile with over 2,500 tanks, aircraft, helicopter, naval vessels spanning everything from the interwar period to today's main battle tanks and jet fighters. Hands down, one of my favorite things about this game is War Thunder doesn't just rely on simple health bars or hit points. Every vehicle is modeled down to the individual parts and components like its engine, fuel tanks, ammunition, and crew. So where you hit an enemy actually matters, and after a vehicle is destroyed, the game's X-ray replay shows you exactly how the shell penetrated the armor, what it damaged internally, and what ultimately knocked the vehicle out. Now that's pretty sweet, don't you think? If you sign up using my link in the description, new players and returning players on PC and consoles who haven't played in at least 6 months will receive an exclusive bonus pack, but only for a limited time. That includes multiple premium vehicles, an exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account membership to give you a strong head start. Check out War Thunder for free using my links below, and thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Now, back to Europe and China. Strategic autonomy doesn't mean pivot from the US to China. It means Europe stands on its own 2 feet. That is difficult to do when there exists.
They'd be their own. They'd be their own like great power block because the countries of Europe. This isn't the 1700s, right? They don't have the technological and organizational advantages that they did over the rest of the world. So it's kind of the idea of they need to stick together and kind of be their own third power so that they can compete with the likes of the US and China rather than being like just subjugated by others. And because a divided Europe isn't going to be like in the world wars where they like fight amongst themselves and like their own little world. Other countries are just too powerful, right? No, it's going to be they get subjugated and played against each other. That's what's going to happen. So it makes us want to avoid that.
Such a hefty trade imbalance between the EU and PRC. And so Europe has adopted what it calls a de-risking strategy, attempting to wean itself off of foreign dependencies and create economic networks that endure even if relations with China were to sour. The Chinese, wanting to hold on to their strategic edge, obviously are pushing back on this, but with the need for European lithography still necessary to remain competitive, they may be willing to compromise if the Europeans play their cards right. Keep in mind that China does need those lithography machines right now for the sake of competitiveness, but they might not need them 10 years down the line. Europe is on a time limit, and it needs to make the best of that. What the Europeans and Chinese appear to be doing right now is testing the waters, setting new boundaries, feeling each other out for their own strategic benefits. And the thing that should have the US, Russia, and any other skeptical powers worried is that China and Europe might just get everything they want from each other. A very good deal for the Chinese and Europeans, a rough situation for their rivals. I've spoken in the past about why the United States and Russia would make ideal allies to each other, being able to theoretically expand their spheres of influence to encompass all of their ambitions without.
So, hmm. I know that I'm not unfamiliar with Monsters. He has like his politics, right? I know he's like very sort of right wing, and I know he respects things like empire and sphere of influence and wars that kill millions of people. It's like I'm aware of that, so I'm not really surprised that he has a stance like this. But I don't really think so. Like Russia getting all of Europe and China, and this isn't logical. Russia doesn't have the population, doesn't have the economy, doesn't have the military. They can't even subjugate Ukraine for fuck's sake. They're not going to get all of these wealthy, industrially capable countries, China, Japan, Australia. China can't even secure all of Africa. I mean, if China can't get Europe's solidly in sphere of influence, if Turkey is its own great power, basically, by this point, or at least maybe not great power on like a global scale, but at the very least a strong regional power, right? If India is, on it like dominating the Indian Ocean, then Russia's not going to do all this. America, totally dominating the Americas. I mean, you could say that kind of already do, although yeah, China and has like influence. I mean, like countries like Brazil especially are kind of able to project power heavily, but like the U.S. already has like Canada and Mexico like locked into its economically, at least to a large extent. Although with Canada maybe less so after Trump took over and trying to like distance themselves a bit, but I guess if the U.S. really wanted to and there wasn't enough public opposition in this sort of thing for the U.S. sphere of influence, sure, it's plausible. But Russia's not accomplishing this. I'm sorry, it's just not.
clashing with each other, but the only thing holding them back are their present alliances. Europe and China are almost the perfect inversion of that. Two complementary powers situated in the old world with their eyes toward trade in the oceans currently dominated by the United States. The key difference is that China and Europe do have conflicting interests, at least mildly. The Middle East and Central Asia have been of increasing interest to Europe as assets in their pursuit of strategic autonomy. Energy supplies, trade routes, mineral resources, it all flows through here, and China has its eyes on them as well. So clearly, the United States and Russia have nothing to worry about. The Europeans and Chinese will be at each other's throats. Again, not exactly. Competition in the region has manifested less like a Cold War era propping up of proxies and puppets and more like a competitive marketplace where the states of the region invite investment from both players, as both the regional states and Europe develop a sense of security by preventing China from monopolizing their control. Once again, the Chinese have protested this as, quote, needless de-risking. But that's ironic, considering their vocal advocacy for multipolarity in other spheres of the world. The concern on China's side.
Yeah, China's not this, wise civilization. I think, obviously they try and present that image. Um, I think some like idiots in the West even think that they're a small minority, of course. Like, oh, China is going to strategically prick apart the world and then, the world's going to destroy itself, but China will be fine and they will rule over the world. Shut up. They're not any more intelligent than any other human beings, any other civilization. So this is the country that tore itself apart multiple times for the past 2,000 years and like, having people, like warlord eras and people killing each other and such like that over, I don't know, family disputes, land disputes, wealth, the same things that people kill each other over in the rest of the world. Yeah, no, that sort of language is a Machiavellian attempt to increase their power. It's not what they genuinely think, so don't be fooled. Even I've been tempted to fall for that. This idea of China's, oh, it's old and wise. No, nope. I mean, it's old, but wise, no more than any other society. Um, but I mean, yeah. I mean, that it makes sense that it's like in their self-interest to, like, for example, like pry the Americas apart, counter the U.S. and to, prevent, but also to prevent the EU from like doing much in the Middle East as well. It makes sense, right? They're just, doing what's best for them.
Actually stems, at least in part, from its inability to trust the EU. From the Chinese perspective, they see Europe as beholden to the United States, as a possible tool for the US to utilize in its containment strategy. More optimistically, even without the US in play, China does not understand Europe's endgame, largely because of the conflicting stances of its various.
Wouldn't put the UK there. No, they're not a part of the EU anymore, obviously. And then like I think like I don't know what is it, like Norway I think isn't technically part of the EU, but it's like the UK is kind of on their own doing their own thing. Like they kind of like I think cooperate with the EU, but also with the US sometimes. I'm not even sure what the UK is doing geopolitically right now. Actually, I haven't. It's kind of incoherent, I think, but I wouldn't include them in Europe as like a power block. I don't think that's really fair. At least not right now. Maybe that'll change in the near future. We'll see.
Constituent states, and how that contrasts with the Union's broader message. Chinese officials have said the number one thing they want from Europe is a predictable, unified, and consistent policy platform that will allow both sides to set boundaries, establish economic terms, create a number one thing they want from
What China
of
said,
the conflicting stances of its various constituent states, and how that contrasts with the Union's broader message. Chinese officials have said the number one thing they want from Europe is a predictable, unified, and consistent policy platform that will allow both sides to set boundaries, establish economic terms, create a stable and lucrative economic environment for both players. It's a lot of nice words, but is it actually meaningful? We might say that this is just the Chinese trying to sound diplomatic, but there's more to it. China's latest 5-year plan had a very specific focus: building independent resiliency, strengthening domestic production, and reducing reliance on foreign economies. Does that sound familiar? The EU and PRC are both
So any country, especially any powerful country, didn't want to do so. It's not a surprise that the EU and China have the same idea.
in a state of pursuing strategic autonomy, and the question they face is how to balance that with their current trade dynamics. China needs European lithography. Europe needs rare earth minerals. The European market is an irreplaceable asset for China, while Chinese solar and green tech is the forefront of technology Europe is after for its renewable energy push. Looking at the direction these countries are attempting to move in economically, there's a clear pathway for partnership that probably no other country can fill. But that doesn't mean these two are likely to become quick friends. Let's be real, the biggest breaking points between Europe and China aren't Taiwan, pollution, even human rights violations. It's Russia. It's always been Russia.
Yep.
The Europeans see Russia as a fundamental threat to their survival, and the way they see it, China has at best tacitly supported Russia in Ukraine, and at worst, has actively participated in helping the Russians. That's not something Europe is willing to let slide, nor are they willing to deepen their ties with China if Chinese wealth is just going to flow into Russia and be used against them. Forced to choose between the two, Europe does objectively have more to offer China given its specific circumstances, but what Russia offers is unique. A military buffer, geopolitical reach, oil security. That's hard to replace, and I'm not sure I see the Chinese abandoning that unless something severe happens to Russia or some other circumstance sours ties between the two. But
Yeah, because Russia gives China immense, it kind of, if we think of Russia as being like the Chinese sphere of influence, which it basically is, right? That box is in Central Asia, so Russia can influence them easier. It makes, places like Iran and Pakistan kind of close to the Russian sphere of influence. If you look at it from like a sort of, yeah, just, it allows for China to have like an ally that can threaten Europe in case of any future issues with them, or any current or future issues, because, they reconcile with Europe, they ban Russia, okay, and China and Europe have a dispute again later because over the, I don't know, the Middle East something, and then now China no longer has an ally to use against Europe, right? So it's like, it makes sense that they would want to like preserve what they already have rather than taking a gamble of having to like negotiate with a new equal and like, who knows how that'll go in the future. Having this weak state is you can kind of see how that's better for, for like a cautious perspective than like gambling on a society powerful enough to just like say, no, 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 we're good, fuck off, China.
in either case, a status quo of attempting to balance the two is likely to persist for the Chinese, even if this limits the extent of their partnership with Europe. China isn't idealistic. It sees the utility of Europe and understands what it wants to get out of them. It can probably achieve that while keeping the Russians close. But it will probably leave room open to swap to Europe if it needs to. Europe is looking to free itself from dependency on Russian energy, dependency on American security, and dependency upon Chinese trade. But at least here there is ample room for negotiation. The most adversely impacted by this from a geostrategic standpoint is the United States,
Yeah.
as influential reach in the old world is diminishing, and if the Europeans and Chinese successfully forge a mutual understanding, containment of the Chinese will become far more difficult for the United States, potentially schisming global trade along hemispheric lines, in which the US has extremely limited reach in the old world, while the Chinese and Europeans expand and consolidate their economic spheres in Africa.
It'll also make it harder to oppose China, even in East Asia in the long run, right? Because if you're looking like over here, right, if the U.S. has to fight a war with China, in this sort of area, then if especially if Chinese missiles are able to like destroy the bases and everything, then China gets more wealthy than they are now relative to the U.S., gets more militarily advanced, and the U.S. isn't able to pull on like European wealth and manpower and such to help them out, then it's like puts the U.S. in a bad position, especially on the continents, right? Especially with nations like South Korea, Vietnam, those are societies, right, which the U.S. is kind of like currently close with, but actually, China's able to like economically pull them away, diplomatically pull them away, which, with Trump in office, we'll see how things go in the future. Maybe we'll get like a new Joe Biden type figure geopolitically, but even other officials will be wary, right? The memory of Trump isn't going to disappear. So, yeah, the US's position in Asia is Especially, yeah, if we're talking about like these, like China and the EU, like fully reconciling rather than now where it's kind of like, complicated, then yeah, that it would be pretty bad for the US and in Asia for sure. And in Europe, outside of like an invasion of Greenland for some reason, it would be hopeless, yeah. Um, yeah.
Africa, the Middle East, and Central
I guess the US could, I mean, it could still like influence Africa and shit like that, right? There's the Middle East, the US wouldn't be fucked in the old world unless if the EU and China come to like a full alliance. No, with their current strength, the US still wouldn't be fucked in the old world, at least not yet. Depends on if China's able to like develop to the same level as like, the US in terms of GDP per capita or even like come close, even like get halfway there, but that's not gonna happen for a very long time. So, we're really looking at long-term trends for it to actually be crippling for the US. But for it to be damaging, yeah, that could happen immediately.
Asia. But what do you, the viewer, think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like this video if you enjoyed it, hit the hype button, and subscribe for more. And of course, thanks again to War Thunder. Remember to hit the link in the description below to play for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile, and take home some sweet perks for a limited time only, including multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle
All right, well, I
decorator.
already saw that. Okay, that's going to be it for this video, and goodbye.